All right. So my name is Joe Rexwinkle. I am with the City Planning and Development Department, and what we're here to talk about tonight is a proposed infill residential development ordinance. Well, that's a kind of a mouthful, but we'll talk through what that means to us. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. This right here is a link to the this video that we're recording on YouTube. Obviously, it's not streaming right now, but I believe the link will work if you want to go ahead and capture that with your smartphone. That's a QR code on the left. You should be able to forward that link that opens, the page that opens, to any friends of yours or anyone who you know that might be interested in this. And they would be able to view it, of course, once it's posted. If you do not have a smartphone or do not prefer to use the QR code, the URL is also available below if you would like to capture that as well. Just a little bit about Zoom. I think most people have become quite familiar with it over the past few years, but what you should see on your end is a screen that appears similar to the one on the left. At the bottom middle of that screen, there are 4 options that you can select. One is a Q&A option, and another is a chat option, the raise hand option, and a settings option. You probably won't have a need to use the settings or raised hand option, but you will likely need to use the Q&A and chat option this evening. We do have a question that is available to you in the question and answer option now. Just trying to gauge your level of interest in this particular topic, and so that we can better understand what it is that we need to share with you and what type of feedback might be most helpful to you. It's also important to note that this is the first in a series of meetings we plan to hold regarding this particular ordinance. And so the chat feature as well is available to you throughout this presentation to share your thoughts and questions. And we will attempt to, at the end of this, answer some of those questions, but we'll also retain them in our notes so that we can help answer those questions later. All right, so this is a survey that we're asking you all to complete. Again, like I said, this is just helping us gauge the level of interest and information that you believe you have or need regarding the proposed ordinance. So far, it looks like most of you know something about infill development generally, and that perhaps you know a lot or a little bit, or as it says, enough to be dangerous. We all feel that way about some things, that's for sure. So that's good. We're dealing with here, it looks like, an audience that generally knows what we're about to talk about. That's very helpful. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and close that poll down. All right, the chat feature, as we mentioned, is just to provide you all an opportunity as we go through things tonight to share any questions and thoughts you have. And again, we will go through those at the end of this presentation and share our responses. Okay, so we'll move on to the next slide here. So as we asked, how much do you think you know, or do you believe you know, about infill residential development in Kansas City? And you've given us your thoughts. Thank you for that. One more housekeeping item is we're going to share here what our goal is tonight, which is we'll start with some introductions of me and some of my colleagues. We will also then share with you the purpose of why we have a proposed ordinance amendment in the first place, why we're here to present that this evening. It's important to know that the concerns of Kansas City's development community and neighborhoods and other interest groups are very diverse, and planning and zoning in particular cannot resolve all of those concerns. So you don't often hear from people, professionals who say, I can't do everything, but that's what we're saying here. There are limitations to what we can do through policy, through zoning policy and regulation. But we want to do what we can to help address everyone's concerns. We'll wrap up with some next steps. This is the first of several steps that I mentioned previously, so we'll go through that in more detail at the end. And then, of course, we'll spend some time trying to answer some of the questions that you've posed. So let's get into it. Well, let me do introductions. I'm sorry, I forgot to do that. I've already mentioned who I am. I do have with me this evening from City Planning and Development Department, Najma Muhammad, who's one of our planners, Anna Nanaski, one of our lead planners, and Matthew Barnes is also one of our planners. And Matthew and Najma in particular have been really instrumental in conducting a great deal of data analysis that leads us to where we are today that we'll be able to present to you. And they have a wealth of knowledge about what we're about to talk about. So I do appreciate their help. And we also have, it should be noted, we have presented the proposed ordinance to the Center for Neighborhoods staff, as well as Kansas City Neighborhood Advisory Council. And there were a lot of good questions and feedback we got from both. Feedback has really been instrumental in getting us to where we are today, and helping us spread the word about what we're attempting to do. And probably between those two groups, one or more of them made you aware of what we're doing tonight. So we really appreciate their facilitation and their assistance, and we look forward to additional partnerships with them going forward on this ordinance and any future ones. So why are we here today? What is the purpose of this? Bottom line is that we're proposing, a city planning staff, an amendment to Chapter 88 of the city's Code of Ordinances, which is the Zoning and Development Code. The Zoning and Development Code regulates most aspects of the development of private property and public property throughout the city. That includes, if you the home you live in, and how it can be expanded or a new home can be built. The zoning code does place regulations on how that can occur. The amendments that we're proposing to that code, if approved, would help with the provision of new housing and reinvestment in existing housing stock throughout the city, particularly in areas where infrastructure and services are already available. Kansas City is a growing community in more than one dimension. We are growing on the edges of the city. We're converting undeveloped land into new neighborhoods and shopping centers all the time, but we're also fortunate that we have growth and demand in the market for new growth within the established areas of the city. And that's what infill development is to us. So the proposed amendment would work by streamlining the development process for contextually appropriate residential development in infill situations. Like most cities, our zoning code is structured under the assumption that every kind of development is new development, and that is just not true. A lot of development is redevelopment in existing neighborhoods or new development on undeveloped properties in existing neighborhoods. And again, that's what we consider to be infill development. I'm going to briefly try to describe how we define certain things, and I think that's will hopefully be helpful in understanding some of the things that we say down the road in this conversation. I'll briefly touch on now some of the basic history of zoning in Kansas City, which is that the city's first zoning ordinance was adopted in 1923, and as most of us know, a large part of the city was established prior to 1923. So in that sense, it's very fair to say that a lot of the rules that apply to how a home can be built or a lot can be created were applied retroactively to lots that were created prior to the rules being adopted. And that's very common. Kansas City is not unique. Many large cities have the same issue that we do with that regard, and there's a lot of different approaches for how to deal with that, and we'll get into a little bit of that. A little bit about our role is, we do a lot of different things, but one of the main things our job is to keep an eye on the trends, what we're hearing from our neighborhoods and what we're seeing on the ground in terms of what's getting built and if it's compatible with what's near it, and to see what our peer communities and peer cities are doing and how they're responding to issues. And when we do that, we identify whether our policies and regulations address those issues. And we see a gap here where our policies tend to favor the new development that I was talking about on the fringes of the city. And that serves a disadvantage to our established neighborhoods and the people that want to invest in those neighborhoods. So what we're proposing here is a change to the city regulation that relates to that. We also want to talk about what is development. I think even as planners who work with developers all the time and deal with development all the time, it's very easy to slip into the perception that development is something big. It is something massive. It is something dynamic that changes the community all around it. And that is development, and that is a fair amount of it. But there's also a lot of other types or ways of developing land within Kansas City. There are developments that might be smaller in scale. If you are adding a deck to the back of your house and you're the homeowner, you're a developer in the purest sense. And so we want to really expand what a development is and what a developer is. It can be almost anyone, anyone who is investing in a piece of ground by developing it in some way. Really, at its core, you are a developer. We also want to kind of try to define what infill is. And I've gone through that a little bit already. There is a movement underway in Kansas City. We're talking a lot about housing affordability. This ordinance is not an affordability ordinance, but we have to be conscious of the needs of the community as we're working on any ordinance amendment. And we are conscious of the needs of the community and the conversation happening out there about how we create affordable housing up and down the income scale. It's a problem for many people finding adequate affordable housing. One of the ways that we think that the zoning ordinance can help facilitate that is by accommodating, lifting barriers to the reinvestment of our existing neighborhoods, allowing people in their homes, even if they're on a lot that's non-conforming or not non-conforming, we'll talk about that in a minute, to reinvest without barriers. That's easy to do if you're a developer who is building large-scale projects, because you tend to have a team of people that are helping you navigate the city's processes. But if you're a homeowner who's trying to repair your front porch and that porch is non-conforming and you have to go through multiple steps to get that repaired, you're much more likely to give up because of the burden and the hassle of going through those various steps. So what we're talking about here is trying to lift some of those barriers to make it easier for people to do that. That's across the board. So this would this benefit large scale developers? Maybe, but most of them are already doing developments that have to go through what we call an entitlement process, which is a public hearing process that goes through Planning Commission and City Council. So they're kind of used to having to do that anyway. This ordinance does not touch on that. This ordinance does not change zoning in that regard in any way, or the procedures in any way in that regard. It is talking about smaller scale development within our neighborhoods. And then finally, a little bit about conforming versus non-conforming, because you'll see that come up this evening. Conforming is a lot or a house or a residential building. And to be clear, we're only talking about residentially zoned properties and residential buildings with this ordinance. We're not talking about anything that's non-residential, anything industrial or commercial. So when it comes to a residential development, a conforming residential building would be one that complies with today's zoning standards. A non-conforming one would be one that does not. And typically, the ones that are non-conforming were developed at a time where the rules were different. Or in the case of anything developed prior to 1923, they were developed when we didn't have rules about how that home or that lot must be created. And as you'll see, there are a number of challenges if you happen to have purchased a non-conforming lot or inhabit a non-conforming home. That creates a lot of challenges for you in reinvesting in it or building on that non-conforming lot. So there's two parts of the proposed ordinance. There is a proposed amendment to the minor subdivision ordinance in chapter 88. And there is also a proposed amendment to our lot and building standards. And very briefly, we will describe what a subdivision is, and that'll help you understand what the minor subdivision ordinance is. So a subdivision is just the dividing of land to create lots that are buildable. It is something that every lot that someone has a house on or any residential building on in the city, they're on a piece of ground that was subdivided for something larger, a piece of ground that was larger at some point in history. And the subdivision is just the process by which, or the rules by which you follow to create those pieces of land. There are currently 2 procedural paths in chapter 88 in the zoning code that a property owner may be eligible for in proceeding in subdividing their land. One is minor subdivisions. Minor subdivisions are administratively approved. And we'll get into some of that, and that's because that's the part of the amendment. And another one is major subdivisions, which requires planning commission and sometimes city council approval as well. That process is considerably costlier because it's lengthier and riskier for anyone engaging in it. So the problem with the current minor subdivision ordinance that we have, first of all, I want to be very clear, it exists today. We're just proposing to amend it. There's 3 main issues with it. It conflates eligibility criteria with approval criteria. It's a little in the weeds for a lot of you, but if there are any surveyors or engineers that work with us on this call right now, you kind of understand what we're talking about. It creates a lot of confusion internally and city staff, as well as with the design professionals that we work with, about whether subdivision that they're proposing is even eligible for a minor subdivision process. We want to fix that. That is not really a policy change. That is just clarifying the language. Issue 2 is that it assumes every subdivider is creating new lots. This also is not a policy change. We are clarifying when a subdivider is creating new lots and clarifying what the rules are for that situation versus when they're not creating new lots. And you might think, you know, who's doing a subdivision and not creating new lots? And in reality, my staff that work on these subdivisions, they have 334 active cases right now. And the majority of them are cases where someone is simply adjusting a shared lot line between them and their neighbor's property. Their neighbor wants to sell 5 feet of the backyard to them. And so they're adjusting that lot line. They have to go through this process now, and it's lengthy and costly for them. And they would prefer not to. And we think that this ordinance will allow them to do something simple like that without having to go through that approval process in most cases. The third issue is that anytime someone does want to create new lots, if they want to create more than six or more, they have to go through a major subdivision process. That the number 5, 6 is arbitrary, and frankly, any number you put here is kind of arbitrary. There's no rule of thumb about which number is good or bad, but what we are finding increasingly are people who want to buy a bundle of lots from a neighborhood association, perhaps, who has purchased lots that were not maintained by the prior owners, or a bundle of lots from the land bank, so that they can build houses on them. And in many cases, they're in a situation where they're having to recreate more than 6 lots. And that's pushing them into a major subdivision process, which I mentioned earlier is a considerably lengthier and costlier process. So again, the solution, what is the solution we're proposing to all of this? We are proposing to make city approval, or to remove the requirement for city approval when someone's reestablishing lots, and we can explain what we mean by that in a moment. They're utilizing the existing platted lots that the city already approved and hit back in the day, many decades ago in most cases, and they're reestablishing them. We're proposing to allow that by right, which means there's no approval process for it. We are proposing to create individual subdivision types so that it's clear which one you fall into and what the requirements are for each one. And the goal of that is to get some return on the investment, the private investment that's being made for the public. The thing that happens with major subdivisions is that public infrastructure gets improved when a major subdivision happens. What we're proposing, and typically it doesn't with a minor subdivision, that's one of the big differences. What we're proposing is if you're creating new lots, 6 or more new lots, you have to make some public improvements. You have to give back to the community that you're doing that in. So this is just kind of a graphic that we hope illustrates the 4 different types of minor subdivisions that the ordinance proposes. From left to right, they're type 1, type 2, type 3, and type 4. The only new type of minor subdivision is type 3. So we'll spend more time on that probably. We are just categorizing the other types of minor subdivision into their own distinct category so that the regulations pertaining to them are more clear to everyone. So a type 1 minor subdivision is where there's no net increase in lots under any circumstances. It might be where someone is combining 2 lots, so they're decreasing the number of lots. It might be where someone is adjusting a shared lot line. Right now, if you're combining lots, you don't have to have city approval. You can go to the county, the respective county, and consolidate those lots. We're proposing to add one more type to that, and that is a lot line adjustment if the lot line adjustment is consistent with an underlying platted lot line. So there is a small policy change there that would eliminate this. That's the customer that I was explaining earlier that might be trying to buy a portion of their neighbor's backyard. Of course, the neighbor agrees to it, they're selling it, but the lot line adjustment is consistent with an underlying platted lot line. If you're doing that, we're proposing that you're just allowed to do that without prior city approval. Type 2 is where you're allowed to create up to 5 new lots. That's what the current ordinance already allows. There's really no change there at all. We're just now calling it type 2. You're allowed to create up to 5 new lots. Type 3 is where you're allowed to create up to 20 new lots. Again, this number 20, there's not a science behind why we arrived at 20. What I can tell you is we looked at many city blocks where we'd have undeveloped properties or vacant properties, and the rough average was somewhere between 15 and 25 lots per block. And so that's kind of how we came up with it. We are flexible on that number. If there's a good reason for why it should be lowered or increased, we're willing to listen to that. This would be the new type of minor subdivision. And this type of minor subdivision would be approved by staff. It would have to follow the ordinance that we're going to lay out in a moment. And it would open up a simpler path to what we call incremental development, or small developers who are buying a few lots at a time and want to build houses on a few lots at a time. That's part of the market that we think is missing. There are people that are doing that and trying to do that, but they're often having to get variances or major subdivision approvals, and that procedural path is very risky for them, and in many cases it prevents them from building the housing that most of us probably want in these neighborhoods. Type 4, I'm not going to spend much time on that. It's a condominium plat. We're not changing anything in that part of the minor subdivision ordinance. We're just simply calling condominium plats type 4 now. We're just to have consistent naming terminology. It is a unique type of minor subdivision in that it is a three-dimensional property separation, and it's what you find in a condominium building. So here's a scenario of the minor subdivision ordinance. So what you're looking at here is the same property on the right and the left. The image on the right shows you the property owned by this owner in yellow, and in pink is the platted lot line. This is a plat that was approved by the city likely many decades ago, and it's very possible that at one time there was a house on each of those two platted lots that you see on the right. But over time, for whatever reason, this owner purchased that property. The house, if it was ever there, was demolished clearly. And what you see now is one lot. Under the current ordinance, if one or more of those lots is non-conforming, they're deemed combined. And they can split them under certain circumstances, but not always. And even if they do split them, they have to do that through a minor subdivision process to simply reestablish if they wanted to reestablish the pink line and sell that southern half of the property, or build a house on the southern half and sell it, they would have to go through a minor subdivision process. That doesn't kill all projects, but if someone is like you or me, and they just own the property and they want to sell to someone who wants to build a house on it, it can make it almost impossible to do, because we don't have the deep pockets that some of the developers in the development community might have. So this is an image of that property. What you see in the red is the lot on the south side that's undeveloped. And our current ordinance says you can't develop that. Or if you do, you have to go through a process that's risky and may not get approved. So this ordinance is twofold, and I mentioned earlier there's two parts to it. The second part is about lot and building standards, and I'm going to go back to the last screen for a minute. The people that have been successful at being able to build on these vacant lots can, under the current ordinance, our conventional development standards, can build a home that's often quite out of context and scale with what's nearby. And that's because the conventional development standards are different than what was built, often the context of what was built in these established neighborhoods. They tend to allow homes that are larger in scale that have garages on the front or driveways in the front when you can see there's a driveway here, but in some of our established neighborhoods, that's not a predominant feature. And that can be very disruptive to neighbors and to the character of the neighborhood. So our approach was, if we have many people saying we need to find a way to make it a bit easier to create these lots, to reestablish them so people can build on them. And our approach was, yes, that's true. We also need to make sure that what gets built on them respects what's around it. And so we see this as integral. You need to have both. You need to have both improvements to the minor subdivision ordinance as well as to our lot and building standards to help control what ultimately is built on this vacant lot. So that's what this is here. I'm not going to go through every word on this slide. There's a fair amount of text there, but what our ordinance currently has for lot and building standards is conventional types of standards, which is the vast majority of the city falls under conventional lot and building standards. We also have open space and conservation standards, and only 2 developments have been created with those standards, and they have not been built. So when I say the vast majority, I really mean everything in the city falls under our conventional standards. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the standards in the zoning ordinance assume development is new development on an undeveloped agricultural field, for example. And conventional standards were great in that scenario. They don't work very well when you're trying to apply them to an existing neighborhood. They tend to allow development on these properties that's out of scale or proportion or character with what's nearby. So we're proposing a 4th type of lot and building standards that we refer to as infill development standards. These would apply to any residentially zoned lot anywhere in the city, which meets the definition of infill residential development or an infill residential lot, which we'll go to in a minute. The reason why we need to do this as well is because we have many lots in the city that are non-conforming, that would have to go through a minor subdivision or major subdivision process under the current ordinance to be buildable. And what you see on the right in red is obviously the entire city, but the red dots are the non-conforming lots. We believe there, the data shows us there are more than 23,000 non-conforming lots in Kansas City. So this is not a minor problem. This is not a problem that is limited to one area of the community. It is widespread. Of course, it's concentrated in certain areas of the community. And as you'll see, it's concentrated in areas that were largely developed prior to 1923 when we adopted our zoning ordinance. The result of this, of course, as I've mentioned previously, is that many people who are interested in, if they have a home on the property and they want to improve it or reinvest in it, are stymied by having to do a certificate of legal non-conforming use, which is a mouthful, but that's something that's a process that they may have to go through to demonstrate that it was legally built, that the home was, or that they would have to get variances, which are, you know, not always approved. There's a risk with that. Sometimes they even have to go as far as rezoning the property. And in order to make the lot legal, in terms of the lot size, they often have to zone to a district that allows a bunch of uses that most people would not want in their neighborhood. And that's a big issue as well. We don't want to correct one issue and create a lot of other problems by rezoning it. And as you can see with the distribution, while it is widespread, it is concentrated in areas of the community where the market values overall are lower, and we want to encourage homeowners that are there to be able to stay in their home and age in place and reinvest in it in a manner that allows them to do that. And they're going to encounter issues with the fact, in many cases, with the fact that their home or their lot may be non-conforming. So what is the solution? We are creating the lot and building standards that are for infill development that are context sensitive. And what that means is that instead of prescribing a set setback. So let me talk about what lot and building standards are. They control for the height and the size and the placement of a house on a lot. Without those, someone could build a house right next to you that sits right next to the street, but your house is set back 30 feet from the street. And that would obstruct your view. It would be out of character with the rest of your block. So the setbacks are really, and the lot and building standards are really important. They control the appearance and the feel of the development that happens in ways that are much more impactful than their numbers would have you believe if you looked at them. The current setback standards and lot and building standards, as I mentioned, are conventional and work really well in the emerging areas of the community. But what they do then is they force someone to build a home that you might find in one of our newer neighborhoods. And of course, our newer neighborhoods are different than our older ones. That's just the nature of things. So that's where you run into compatibility issues. The context sensitive approach would require the person building on the infill lot to build a home that is similar in size, scale, and setback to the other homes on the block. It would also say that if you want a garage, for example, but the rest of your block doesn't have a front-facing garage or a driveway, then you can't do that on your street. So what we're attempting to do here is to not create a one-size-fit-all, to actually at the block level on your block, create a scenario where someone can build in a manner that's respectful of the rest of the lots in the block and the homes on your block. We talked briefly about the missing middle. I want to point out here that the missing middle housing type, some of you may have heard of that before, and we've all seen it in the past several decades, that the market has been building predominantly in the newer areas, especially newer areas of the city, predominantly single family homes and apartments. And there's a lot of different residential building types you can have in between those two. And in the established areas of the city, mainly the ones built prior to 1923, we do have that housing stock. We do have townhouses. We do have our colonnades that we love. We have our walk-up apartments. In a lot of cases today, it's almost impossible to build those. And it has a lot to do with the density or the number of units in those buildings. We're not proposing to make any changes with this ordinance. We want to be very clear to allow these types of buildings in locations where they're currently not allowed. This really will benefit mainly the single family homes that are allowed. So again, it applies only to the residential building types that are currently allowed in their zoning district. If you're in an R5 or an R6 zoning district, then single family is the predominant building type that's allowed, and this will benefit that building type. If you're in an R1.5 zoning district, apartment buildings and townhouses are allowed. So would this benefit those building types? Sure, because those building types are already allowed. One thing it would do is it would ease the non-conforming burden on our existing missing middle housing types. So if you have a colonnade that's non-conforming currently, it's an existing colonnade, and it's 6 or 8 units, it's almost always non-conforming because of the number of units in it, not because the building type. I think most people like the building and the building type. It's the number of units in it. That poses a lot of issues for someone who's trying to maintain that building. Every time they have to get a permit to do any work, they have to show that their building and the number of units was legally established. They have to produce paperwork and go through a certificate of legal non-conforming use process. They even sometimes have to go through a variance process. The effect that has is it discourages responsible ownership of these properties. It discourages people who want to maintain and invest in those buildings because it's too hard to do that. So this ordinance would lift the density requirements on that. Again, it doesn't allow those buildings and new construction of those buildings in districts where they're not allowed, but it does allow the buildings that were built and designed for 6 units that have 6 units in them, so that they can reinvest in the building and maintain it without the barriers to doing so. We've talked a lot about infill residential development, infill lot. I'm not going to read these. I think you can read them yourself, but these are the definitions of what we think, in our opinion, constitute an infill residential lot. For example, is anything that was described by deed or plat recorded prior to January 1st, 1954. And the reason that date is there is because that's the date the city adopted subdivision regulations. Prior to that, there were no rules about the size of a lot or the width of a lot. So if your property was created prior to that date and it's been made illegal because of rules applied to it after that date, this ordinance will help it to become legal, so you don't encounter those barriers. The other option is if you were annexed into the city after January 1st, 1954, and it's the same reason. If you were in Kansas City prior to that, we didn't have rules. But if you were outside of the city and we had no jurisdiction over you, and the lot was created that way, that's also not your fault. That if you're the property owner, it's not your fault that you got annexed and then the city placed their rules on you. So a little bit about the data. I'm going to share with everyone here some of the data that has been mapped, showing our non-conforming lots. And I'm going to do a couple things here initially, just to show you kind of a closer inspection of everything in purple, which is kind of hard to see. I'll take off the grouped ones. Everything in purple is a non-conforming lot. It obviously is concentrated in some areas more than others, but it's very widespread, as you can see.
Joe, can I stop you for a second? You're not sharing your screen.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay. Now you can see it, right?
Correct.
That's helpful. Zoom is telling me now that participants can see the screen. It was not telling me when they couldn't. So, technology. So again, what you see here in purple is non-conforming lots. And I'll say again, since you couldn't see it before, that you can see they're certainly concentrated in certain areas, but the problem is widespread. It goes all the way out to Lee Summit and all the way up by the airport. And would this fix the problem for every single one of these lots? No, it would not. But for the areas where it's most concentrated and for the vast majority, it would help to alleviate many of the barriers that they see currently. I'm also going to add the grouped non-conforming lots, and we understand this is very in the weeds, and so certainly feel free to ask questions about this. The group non-conforming lots is really critical because the current ordinance says that if you're grouped with another non-conforming lot, you're combined with them. And that means that if there were 7 conforming lots and one of them was non-conforming and they're all owned by you, then they're all combined, and the only thing you can do by right without some sort of approval process is build one house on those 8 lots. The effect that has over the long term is depopulating the city. And I think most of us realize that that's the opposite direction from what we want to do and where we want to go as a city. So that's a policy that we have to find a way to deal with. And we think this ordinance does that in a fair and respectful way to our neighborhoods. So we will make this map. I believe we will make this map available to everyone on our website so that you can play around with it. You can type your address in the top left to see if your property is non-conforming and identify if you're a neighborhood advocate. You can experiment in your neighborhood to see the problems or the extent of the problems that you face in your community. And this will be really helpful, we think, for you all. And hopefully it will help you identify whether this really impacts you, this ordinance does or does not impact you. And if it does, we'll talk at the end about how you can become more involved as we head forward, because we do want to talk with you one-on-one about it, and we want your feedback. There's nothing about this ordinance that's set in stone. Obviously, it ultimately has to be approved by the city council, but we're wanting to create something that works for as many neighborhoods as possible. So we wanted to show you this. We encourage you to experiment with it once we post it, and share your thoughts and your questions with us. All right, I'm going to go back to the presentation, which will stop. We appreciate your patience. All right. So we want to provide a little bit of visualization of the effect of the current ordinance versus the proposed ordinance. So there's two images you see here. Please jump in on it if you can't see what I'm showing. But there are two images here that you can see on your screen. On the left is the block, and I want to be very clear. You don't see what these houses really look like, but this is an actual block in Kansas City with actual lots and houses on it that we thought was really important to provide for some context. What you see on the left with like the slope down the street is real and important to help visualize what we're trying to convey here. So what you also see though on the right and left are boxes. These are three-dimensional diagrams. And what you see on the right in green is a three-dimensional box that represents what could be built on that lot today under the conventional development standards. And this is why when you see the development occur on these properties, it seems out of scale because that's legal, that's allowed, that's easy to do. What is proposed is, and I'll go ahead and play the video that gives you some perspective here on the left. What is proposed are the infill standards, which would only allow you to build the smaller of the two diagrams. Well, just bear with me while this pans around. What I think this shows you is that what could be built under the proposed ordinance, which now is visible in the green lines, green diagram on the right, is much more contextually appropriate with the scale and character of the neighborhood around it, of the block around it. And that's achieved by the context-based lot and building standards that we're proposing. These are just some more examples of what you might see on a typical block. You may see a colonnade or 6-unit apartment building in the middle of the block. That's fairly common, particularly in Midtown. But then you also may see a house that was built in the recent past, like the one you see on the right. That's 2 stories. It's not extremely out of scale with what's around it, but it has that garage, and none of the other houses do. That's allowed currently in most cases. This ordinance would restrict that. So that's kind of the ordinance at a high level. There's obviously text that is available on our website that you can look at if you're really interested in the language of the proposed ordinance, and we would encourage you to look at that along with the map. At this point, I'm going to shift it over to Najma Muhammad, who's going to provide us with some closing remarks. Najma.
Thank you, Joe. Can you hear me okay?
Sure can.
Perfect. Well, thank you. I think that was a really good overview of what this ordinance is and what it's going to provide for the non-conforming lots of our city. I'm really excited to see the comments that the map is helpful. Dr. Wagner did post the link to that map in the chat. So if you want to click on it, type in your address, see if your parcel of land that your house that you want is on is considered conforming or non-conforming. You're not in trouble if it's non-conforming. Actually, this ordinance would help that. If you wanted to develop your home in the future, add to your home without potentially going through entitlement processes that go before Board of Zoning Adjustments or City Council or City Plan Commission. So just to wrap up, I will make note that we'll have a question and answer session at the end, so don't be alarmed, we're not finished yet. We just want to close our presentation and allow for you all to have time dedicated to answer some of the questions you all are putting in the chat and in the question and answer box. Thank you for using that question and answer box. It helps us filter out these questions. If you feel comfortable transferring your questions over to that question and answer box so we can have them all in one place, please do so. So we've covered a lot of why KCMO needs this process and what this process is. And so to conclude, I just want to reiterate who this process is for. Our goal is to make sure that the steps we take moving forward and adjustments we make in policy are intentional. We as a community, we as planners, we strive not to repeat the mistakes of the past and stumble across new ones that may further disenfranchise members of our community that already face systemic barriers in our society. The purpose of the new ordinance is to create complementary policy changes to other goals that we have across the city, which includes the development and maintenance of accessible and affordable housing, removing barriers like the entitlement process, as I mentioned before, that may deter homeowners from improving their homes, and legalizing greater volumes of lots and building standards that can support new developers and incremental developers who may not have as many financial resources or time to put toward longer projects, who maybe just want to help you develop your home or other homes on your block. It'll also encourage the use of land that have already been developed in the past, which means using the existing infrastructure that already exists and not going out into the areas of the city that does not have infrastructure yet, but instead building and maintaining our existing housing stock and the existing lots we have in the inner area of Kansas City, Missouri. Of course, this is not perfect, and excuse me, I'm talking a little fast. This is not a perfect process and it will not be seamless. As Mr. Rexwinkle was saying earlier, we can't fix every problem for every lot, but we hope that the contextual nature of this ordinance will help a majority of the non-conforming lots in our city. There are limitations to what we can do in city planning and development, which is why we strive to make adaptable policy changes that can support future improvements made by other departments in our city, like parks and public works. We take all of your concerns into consideration, and we will address what we can and direct the proper entities to support the advancement of projects that are not within our power to instate, enforce, and maintain. With that being said, we want to hear from you about understanding what our limits are as city planning and development. What are other areas in zoning and development that you would like to see addressed through policy in the future? You can put those answers in the chat. We're really curious to know. It can be about infill, it can be about affordability and how we can impact that through zoning and development. Again, we create the rules and regulations of how you can build, in a sense, and what you can build and where, but we can't control everything. So we'll do what we can. We really want to hear your thoughts on that. I saw a quick question on the map while we're going through the chat. The purple is for the non-conforming lots. So all of that purple you see represents the non-conforming residential lots. The next question is, how can we engage with you about ordinance changes in the future in a meaningful way? So this is a step in the right direction of many ways we'll address different ordinances coming before the public through City Plan Commission and City Council, doing webinars like this. And are there other ways you would like to be engaged in the process? Is having a form on our city website for our Chapter 88 code amendments enough? Do we need other avenues to contact and work with you all to make changes in our zoning and development code? We want to hear what your thoughts are on that as well, and you can put that in the chat. Thank you so much. We are going to put that question up again that we had at the beginning. Joe, if you want to go ahead and start that poll to get a gist of, did this presentation help you understand infill residential development any more than you did at the beginning of the presentation? If not, that's okay. We got some work to do, or maybe we need to watch the video again and answer some questions in greater detail. But if so, awesome. I'm glad that we were able to answer some questions for you. Joe, what are some of the answers we're getting? Because I can't see them.
Okay, sorry, I thought maybe people could. It looks like right now we have more people that know enough to be dangerous.
Ooh, okay.
Which that sounds like Kansas City to me. I like the response there. The other options, of course, are a little bit, and I've read the changes and nothing at all.
Okay.
So it looks like it's shifted to where people feel a bit more confident. And I think that's a good thing. That's great to hear, that, you know, they've shifted from like knowing a little bit or nothing at all to being enough to be dangerous. That's great to hear.
That's good. And I see in the chat questions about clarifying some terms, and we will definitely make those clarifications in this next portion of the presentation through our questions and answers. But before we get to that, I want to go over next steps of how you can get involved. So coming up, as Joe mentioned before, we will have some more intimate discussions for neighborhoods. These will be on a neighborhood level, and there may be more than one neighborhood group at a time, but we'll have 4 opportunities to meet with the community to talk about this in greater detail, particularly for those areas that will be impacted the most by this ordinance change because of the volume of non-conforming lots in your area. We have 4 Thursdays in a row starting on April 14th, all with a start time of 6 p.m. So if you see this QR code, similar to the link before to get to this webinar, you can point your phone at it using your camera and take a picture of it. Or if you have a updated smartphone, if you point your camera toward the QR code, a link will pop up and you can click on that to get to this survey so we can gauge who we're reaching. If you feel like people have been missed or not engaged enough, please forward this survey over to them so that they can know that they have a chance to speak to us about this ordinance on a more contextual level based on their neighborhood. And so this is going to be available on our website as well. You can see the smaller link there, and I believe Anna's posting a link in the chat to be a little bit more accessible to folks. And so how to fill out the entrance form. If you've already clicked on it via the link or through the QR code, you can go to Parcel Viewer. This is encouraged so we'll know who we're reaching out to, who we've managed to engage. Go to Parcel Viewer, find your neighborhood association, and in that survey, it'll ask you for that. Make sure you include that with your name, your council district, your address, just so we can get a feel for which parts of the city we are getting feedback from. And so after that, in the next 2 weeks, you will get an email inviting you to one of these dates. We encourage you to speak with your neighborhood association so you all can have a consensus on which date to meet. And if you have any questions, if these dates just aren't working for anyone whatsoever, we can do what we can to maybe shift dates and times if absolutely necessary. We're looking forward to you attending these meetings and asking questions that may not be answered all at once tonight, questions that may be more neighborhood specific, and we appreciate all of the feedback. Did I miss anything, Joe?
I think just wrapping up with if you have questions in the meantime, and we certainly expect that some of you will, call and email Najma at the information provided below. No, Najma is very knowledgeable about this and passionate about neighborhoods and would love to talk to you. So there's the public engagement email, which you can send your message and questions to, that's located at the bottom of the screen, and our phone number. You can just ask to speak with any of us, frankly, at that number below at the bottom of the screen. And I will add that we would love to be able to meet with every neighborhood one-on-one. Kansas City is a big city with lots of neighborhoods, so that's just not feasible. So what our goal is to group neighborhoods with similar questions and similar needs, similar locations perhaps, or similar problems and issues together at a round table at each of these meetings. And so that's why we need you to submit your interest, and we will see which neighborhoods are expressing that interest, and then we will group you with neighborhoods near you or that have similar questions as you do, so that we can really try to have a more one-on-one conversation. And I will mention that we are these are virtual meetings at the moment. We are willing to do face-to-face one-on-one meetings if that's in the interest of your neighborhood. So go ahead and share that if that's the case, that you would prefer that, let us know. And we may make a 5th date available, or one of these 4 dates, an in-person meeting. But we will be in touch with you on that. All right, Najma, I'll turn it back over to you, or to Anna, I believe. Do we get to hear from Ms. Staniski at this point? Najma, you are muted if you're talking.
I realized that. So Anna will be moderating our question and answer portion. This will be a chance for your questions that you put in the chat and in the Q&A box to be answered. Some may be answered live, and others may require a little bit more detail, and we will make sure to give that information if we need to get back to you on a question. So Anna, if you want to take it from here, Joe and I will do our best to give great answers to these great questions.
Thank you, and I'm sure you will. So first things first, I do want to clarify a few things about our processes and some of the terminology that was used today. So for clarification, an ordinance of this nature that they're discussing, a text amendment to the Zoning and Development Code, this is a process that gets reviewed by the City Planning Commission. They're the recommending body. And then the city council is the ultimate decision maker. So they will make the final approval of this ordinance. Additionally, when we talk about administratively approved projects or entitlement projects, these are 2 general categories that city staff puts certain types of projects. So for example, an administratively approved project is something such as a short-term rental registration or a building permit, which complies with the Zoning and Development Code. And those items are reviewed by staff analyzing the Zoning and Development Code and other applicable municipal ordinances. This is considered to be more of a streamlined process for people who are, not professional developers or who don't have deep pockets. And this type of approval, again, depending on staffing or other caseloads, can take about a couple of weeks to go through our system, versus an entitlement process, for example, a rezoning, a variance request, a larger development project. Those take lots of review from several bodies of the city, and it can take a couple of months or more to go through City Planning Commission, Board of Zoning Adjustment, if applicable, and City Council. So I saw a few people, commenting on that, and I just wanted to clarify some of our processes as we move forward with discussing this ordinance in detail. So first major question for you, Joe. How can people check the specifics about our lot and building standards and its relationship with the infill residential development ordinance?
We have on our website the language that is proposed, and that language actually includes both the current lot and building standards, the conventional ones that will remain in place, and the proposed standards. So you can kind of look side by side at them there. You'll see that the conventional standards are prescribed. The setback is 25% of the lot depth, regardless of the context of the lot. Whereas with the proposed infill standards, they are an average of the majority of lots on your block. So that's kind of the simplest breakdown of the difference between the two, and you can see both of them in the proposed text language that's on our website.
Thank you. And remind everyone why we are specifically focusing on residential development right now and what kind of tools currently exist, tools or processes that mixed use or commercial development goes through.
There probably will be a need to evaluate mixed use development and commercial development going forward. However, the vast majority of the volume that we see of issues where nonconformities create problems for people that want to develop property is with residential property. So that's why we focused on that first. Many of you probably know that the city is engaged in a new comprehensive plan, and we're kind of taking a wait and see approach on that to see what the policy recommendations of that plan might be as it relates to commercial development. The other reason that we're focusing on residential first is because most commercial development and the people who own those properties are familiar with the entitlement process that Anna just laid out. And so for them, going through an entitlement process might be an irritation, but it's usually not a deal breaker. And so for us, it did not seem to be as urgent of a need or as critical of a need. And so that's why we're focusing on residential first.
Good points, good points. And we went over this during the presentation, so it might be useful to kind of backtrack to those slides, but can you touch base again on the context sensitive nature of this ordinance and how it's not only going to help encourage different housing types, which also then, affects different housing price points that are available throughout Kansas City?
Yeah, if we think of the image of the boxes, and I will try to go back to that here on this screen. If it's hard to develop on a non-conforming lot, then the market will try to find the ones that are not non-conforming, the ones that are conforming first, and a lot of those have been the ones that have been developed. And then they'll turn to the non-conforming lots and they'll go to areas of the community where they can maximize their profit. And the reason why the developer will do that is because there's more risk in developing on a non-conforming lot. They may need variances, and variances don't always get granted. And so because they're trying to find a way to tolerate that risk, they're going to try to maximize their profit. And I want to be very clear about developers, that their job is to develop, whether they're a large scale developer or an incremental developer. And just like any of us, they want to make money at their job. And so I'm not trying to vilify them for wanting to maximize their profit. That's something that they're wanting to do to cover their risk. And so in many ways that is understandable. If our policies, like you see in the black boxes on this screen, allow someone to build a 3-story house where most of the houses are 1 or 1.5 stories, and they feel like that's a big risk for them, they're probably going to maximize it. They're probably going to build that big house and sell it. Of course, the market that they're selling it to is the luxury market in many cases. And so we believe that I'll bring up the word that I think a lot of people have concerns with, but gentrification is actually exacerbated by the current standards because it incentivizes people to maximize their profit, to maximize the building, the size of the building and being proposed. You know, the proposed standards would put a cap on that. And by putting a cap on it, we're also trying to eliminate some of the risk. And that's where the minor subdivision changes come in. We're trying to make these lots conforming so that they don't have the risk. It's hard to get a loan sometimes from a lender if your lot is non-conforming. So in exchange for reducing the risk, they're happy to build something that's more contextually appropriate. If the cap is smaller, if you can't build as big of a house, you're going to be building for a different part of the market in some cases. That is perhaps not luxury in some cases, not in all cases, but in some. And at least the incentives aren't there to force you into that, to make you feel like that's what you have to build for.
Yep. And to kind of piggyback off of what you were saying, you know, planners and city leaders and other design professionals who deal with development all the time, you know, we understand that there is a wide variety of tools and resources that we need to use to solve certain problems that might occur in our community. And this will definitely just be one of them. But if you could conclude our presentation here today by talking about, again, why it is so important for us to use tools such as this infill development standards. Area plans are also a good tool that city leaders and city planners use to make decisions about development. And then something as extreme is not the right word, forgive me, as detailed as the development plan process to get projects done, especially when there's such a wide range of scale of projects that occur within our community.
Right. Yeah, so like the development plan process, I'll start there. It's a common zoning tool that we have in our ordinance. It is, if you read the ordinance, it's intended for large scale development. And by that, I mean, if someone's wanting to build a big box store or a 300 unit apartment complex or an industrial park. And we've had a number of people lately who have had to utilize the development plan process simply because it provides the opportunity to get relief from the conventional development standards or the fact that the lot's non-conforming. But all they're trying to do in these cases is build 4 or 5 houses. So it is a fix to a problem that is way out of scale to the actual project that's proposed in many cases. And so we don't think that's the right use of that tool. And but right now it's one of the only ones we have in our toolbox to help these folks achieve their objective. The other, I think, part of your question was, why is it so important to do this proposed amendment? And you know, I think it's important because we have an increasing volume of this type of activity. You know, for many years, Kansas City was trying to incentivize financially reinvestment in established areas of the community. And we're still doing that, of course. We all see the news. But what has changed in the past 10 or 15 years is the market has really shifted to where people who are responding to individual property owners' needs are wanting to build a house here or 2 there or 4 here. And those are often not the big time home builders that are building new neighborhoods on the fringes of the city. These are the people that are doing the missing middle housing. They're doing the incremental development, and they just do not have the financial and technical resources that a lot of the bigger developers do. Who the bigger developers are used to and able to navigate a entitlement process. And these incremental developers, they do because they have to, but we've seen it kill some projects, you know, just make it infeasible for them to go through that process. And so, you know, that's what they've been banging the drum for a number of years, like fix this so that this is easier. The pressure to develop in this manner has not subsided. It's continued to increase. And it's one of those things where we have to respond. The development pressure is continuing to increase. The tools we're having to use to respond to it are continuing to be and becoming more and more inadequate. And in exchange, we're not getting what we think the communities want. And what we're hearing from neighborhoods is this is out of scale, this is out of character, this is not respectful of what we have. And we just don't feel like the current ordinance is working for anyone. And so what we're trying to propose here and why we feel like it's so urgent is because of the demand and because of the continued development and that occurs in our established neighborhoods that's incompatible.
Thank you, Joe. So we have compiled and analyzed lots of the questions from the Q&A section of Zoom and from chat, and we went over some of the most frequently addressed questions for those of you who are online and still have very specific questions that you need answered. You know, feel free to reach out to staff directly. We can take those conversations online, but just to, you know, for the sake of everyone's time, we'll move on to the next step portions of the presentation. Najma and Joe, go right ahead.
So as previously stated, we can go back to that slide for the flyer on our neighborhood fireside chats. Please use the QR code in the link. We can post that link again in the chat, and everyone who registered for tonight's event will be getting this via email to be able to do the interest form and get those email correspondence from us about the next neighborhood meetings. If you all, again, have any specific questions, my line is open, meaning email me, use the public engagement email, make sure you're very specific and saying infill residential development, or it may get lost in the sauce. So thank you all for coming tonight and for registering ahead of time and being present and staying with us for the past almost hour and a half. Again, for the more specific questions, please email those, and I encourage you all to go over the Infill Development Ordinance suggestions on our Chapter 88 Code Amendment site. We can drop that in the chat one more time just so you all have it. And yes, have a great evening. Be safe. Joe, if you have any other remarks.
Just thank you everyone for your time. It's very precious and we appreciate it. And we look forward to continuing to work with you on this and any other future amendments. Have a good evening.